Hey, this is Steve in Dallas, Texas. It's Saturday morning, and you, my friend, are listening to Light Talk.
Good morning. This is Stan in Gainesville, Florida, and today we are discussing keystoning, Stanley McCandless Part 2, and The Great White Way, all on Light Talk.
And this is David coming to you from the beautiful Belmont Shore area of Long Beach, California. And if you don't already know, you are listening to Light Talk, and we are the Lumen Brothers.
Sub comes tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm
right.
in SubLand. It's in Florida.
SubLand. Welcome to SubLand.
SubLand.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to episode 167. And right off the presses from Light Talk Central.
I like that sound effect. Keep that.
News. Hey, we have our news of the week. And the big news this week was this past weekend for episode 166, we broke a new weekend record for downloads.
Wow. Why?
I have my theory on why. I'll tell you in a second. But we went over 1,500 downloads, which is
one
really
weekend,
amazing.
In 48 hours?
Just in 48 hours.
Let's do the math there. That's how many downloads per hour.
9 came from the Faroe Islands. I know that.
We know that.
But yeah, 1,500 downloads. And we actually had broken that record 2 weeks before when we hit, I believe it was 1,200 downloads.
That's 31 downloads an hour or one every 2 minutes.
Could be.
Is that right? Is that
Well, I do have a theory. I think you guys have a theory too. But my theory is that people are just so bored. They were like,
I think that's it. I think I agree with that.
They said, what are these yahoos doing? And then, boy, that's really sad state of our country right now. That's all I have to say.
If Light Talk is becoming that popular, we got to go back to work. We got to reopen.
Steve, do you have a theory on why this is?
No, but I'm having a Corona.
Is it a Corona classic?
Well, I mean, we're knocking on the door of 3,000 Facebook followers. So, I mean, I think as the numbers go up, more people are listening. Just more people are subscribing. So it's it's catching on.
Other industry news: California Governor Gavin Newsom reveals that TV film production can restart on June 12th. Now, we're taping this, on June 8th. So by the time
4 days away.
Yeah, or actually, if you're listening to this, it's like 2 days before. But really, that's pretty amazing. On the other side of the coin, the good news obviously coming from, film production, it looks like it's starting up soon, that Broadway League president Charlotte St. Martin basically has said that they're looking at a possible January reopening Broadway. Now, I've heard this past week different reports that maybe it'd be later in the spring, but this is what they're hoping for. But I'll tell you something. Right now, in the last 10 weeks, Broadway has been losing an average of $35 million a week.
Losing? They're not doing anything. So they're
No, but there are production costs, so there's theater rentals, there's all that stuff going on, and lack of income. They're not
getting, like people are paying their
loss.
lease. They're paying their lease because they're under contract to pay the lease, but there's no show going.
I have no idea what the details are, but as far as income, there's no ticket income happening. Obviously, everybody who's involved, or just about everyone, is not getting paid. It is a real huge problem. But if this continues to that time, January, and I think that's kind of optimistic. Let's hope for the best. That means that there will be a total loss of about $1.5 billion and heading toward $2 billion if it continues into next spring, which I think, unfortunately, was probably the more realistic estimate.
Well, if you look at the numbers of Broadway revenue, the Broadway houses bring in more money in a year than all of the professional sports teams in the greater New York area bring in. They are bringing in more money than the Yankees, the Knicks, the Mets.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's an amazing.
It's a huge industry, and I agree with you. I think the second wave, if it hits, they're saying it's going to hit in November. So I think right now we've been lulled into a false sense of security. And certainly I don't want to make the episode about COVID. But I go out and it's like people are looking at me like I've grown a second head because I'm wearing a mask. And they've stopped doing it around me. Around the neighborhood, you just don't see it anymore. So everyone thinks it's over and done with.
Yeah, that's sad. That's sad.
And maybe it is. But when I look at the numbers coming out of Florida and the numbers coming out of Georgia and the numbers coming out of Alabama, they're on the increase. They're rising. They're not going down.
That's right. That's right. Here, the trend line, you look at the map, you just look at the bar graph, you draw a line. Either it's going up, it's going down, or it's flat, right? And it's going up. And that's what I'm saying. But it's going up because there's increased testing for sure. But that just means you got more people carrying the virus. So, right? And that makes you that's what changes the infection rate. And that does matter.
Well, on a happier note, and in Stan's world, tonight Stan is being honored at Brooklyn College as, what is the title? What are they honoring you for? Outstanding graduate?
I have to look it up. No, it's something distinguished undergraduate alumni, because that's where I got my BFA, and I was the first BFA in technical theater from Brooklyn College, I think. So it's very humbling.
Well, that's wonderful, Stan.
Would have loved to have been in New York for it live last month, but obviously nature had other plans for that.
Yeah. But that's great, Stan. Congratulations. And,
Thanks.
Being honored by your school is an amazing thing. My schools wanted to forget me. They actually denied that I ever went there.
They barred you from campus, right?
SMU. I mean, you never hear Steve say, "Well, David was once, at SMU." They've completely taken me out of their history. Written out of history. It's I'm not that upset about it, even though I sound upset. But
I have your stapler in my office.
You bastard!
It says David Jacques on the end.
I wondered where that damn stapler went.
And I've got some Chris Barreca swag too.
What did Chris leave? I'm afraid to ask.
Chris left some scissors.
Oh, very funny, Steve. Okay. So speaking of the man, Steve has our first listener question.
And it comes from Donnie, all the way up in, the UP of Michigan. My church wants me to create a cross of light in the sanctuary so that it glows a bit. My problem is I have no good place to put the light. My only choices result in a keystoned gobo. So keystoning, if you don't know what that is, typically you think of keystoning, you're projecting an image on an angled surface. So let's say you project a square on it. It will become a trapezoid. It looks like that architectural keystone, so that's kind of where the term comes from. But it's when you project something and it's slightly tilted, slightly canted, slightly out of square, slightly distorted. And it's because you're projecting off axis on this. So what Donnie is talking about, obviously, is there's no place dead front that he can hang his light and his gobo. He's off to one side or the other, so when it projects, we get this distorted cross in the sanctuary. There's a couple things that I would explore. The first thing is I would take a look at a projector. If you have a projector, typically projectors these days have lens shift on them. So you can physically or electronically move that lens around to try to take care of the keystoning. I'm not sure that's going to work. You can go into a really high budget line and find something that you can manipulate on the screen and get exactly what you want. So there's that option also. The other option, which seems like it's bizarre, but I think would probably work too, is just get a custom gobo. And the gobo is already, it is cut to keystone, so when it projects, it unkeystones itself. Gobo Man can do that for you. Enlight can do that for you. So there's a couple choices here. Depending on the quality of your projectors, you may be able to project it off axis and get what you want. Otherwise, do a little math, and both those companies will help you, and they will custom cut a gobo for you. Have you guys had to deal with Donnie's problem anywhere?
I was just wondering if his cross is on a surface or is it sitting, standing off a wall at all? Like, is it you know what I mean?
Well, it says he has a gobo, so I get the impression it's a flat wall, and they want to add a cross to it.
Yeah, yeah. So I think your projector solution is good, particularly the ones that have keystone correction, where you can actually just sort of turn them off pixel by pixel and get it just right. I've never had success having a custom gobo with something that precise cut, because where the light is and the math, I haven't done that and seen that work. But I was also thinking about the word keystone, which actually comes from architecture, which is something that you put if you're building an arc, right, out of stone or whatever. There's a stone that goes in the center that's cut on an angle that really holds all the weight and holds things together. So it's used as a term for holding things together. And I think about Pennsylvania being the keystone state, so keystone has that trapezoidal shape. But yeah, I think, Steve, you hit the two that I would think of offhand. I can't think, if it's on a flat wall, he's got to be a gobo. Those are the only two that I can think of.
Okay, I'm going to tell you guys the trick that I used to use all the time, and it actually works. If you know where the light is going to be hung from the very beginning, you just, before you do anything, is you take a camera and you actually go to that spot where the lens of that light will be, and you take a photograph of the cross on the wall. Then you throw it into Photoshop, and you can actually figure out the keystoning you need in order to actually cut the gobo into that shape and for it to actually be corrected for keystoning.
Really?
It's very close, yeah.
Photoshop's, that's too easy. That's too easy a solution.
I love Photoshop.
I hadn't thought about using Photoshop to do that.
Okay.
Of course you could. Yeah, good idea.
I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, how does it do the math?
You do the math. First of all, you're going to use a zoom fixture. Okay, so that the size is going to be able to change that. Okay. So, but what you do is you actually put the whole thing on a grid. You put the grid over the image, and you can actually see where the keystoning is. So then it's just a matter of changing that. So it's pretty simple. I must say, it's always worked for me. The key is to make sure you get a variable zoom fixture.
Sure.
Right? That's absolutely necessary. Yeah. And once you have that, especially if it's like a wide range of zoom, like let's say it's 10 degrees to 35 degrees, something like that, you should be able to do this pretty simply. So yeah, that's what I used to do. Now, I am sure that there are even more precise ways of doing it nowadays, but I just haven't had to do it, to tell you quite frankly. But I think Steve's idea of the projector really is the way to go, if you have the money to do it. Wanda in LA writes, what is your usual time frame for a project? How much lead time do you expect to have in order to do your best work? Well, this is a really, really good question. And there is no specific time that I have, because a lot depends on a lot of things. How large that project is, how much extra time you may need on it, how large the set is, when that set's going to be done, all that. I mean, there's a huge amount of issues here that we're going to get to in a second. But you have to really be careful, because as lighting designers, we usually are working on multiple projects at the same time. That's really the only way you can survive in this business. So even very big designers, they have studios, and they're trying to figure out which teams of assistants to put on which projects and how much time you have to focus on each particular project. So again, you have the size of the project, right? You've got to balance it with all the other shows you're working on. So sometimes you have like two big projects and a small project. So you're able to balance that through. You always have to take into consideration travel and travel commitments that you may have, because you certainly want to be on site for the most important parts of that production. And if you don't balance that correctly, all of a sudden you're flying from continent to continent, and people aren't thinking that you're spending enough time on their show. And that is the one thing that I always say that you have to be careful about, because you do not want to overbook yourself. You want to make sure that you are focused on that show. And also, every now and then, you'll have a last-minute gig come up. For instance, let's say for some reason a light designer couldn't finish the show, and they call you to come in to finish the show, then that adds a whole nother element into your time commitments. Understand those last-minute gigs, also postponements of your shows, cancellations like we just had. Make sure you have all that spelled out in your contract. So normally, to answer the question as a broad generalization, my lead time for a show is usually anywhere between 1 and 3 years. Sometimes it's 6 months if a last minute show comes up, but it's usually like 1 to 3 years. But yeah, I really need to learn how to work on a calendar and a schedule so you know that you have enough time to do the projects. How about you guys?
Well, I'm using 6 months to a year, and it's the nature of the type of work that I'm doing. So, I think what Wanda has to think about too is how much work she actually is doing. I'm doing no programming. I'm doing very little drafting. I'm turning that over to an assistant. I'm turning over the interaction between the design at the theater to an assistant to the master electrician. So I'm worried only about artistry and not a lot of the support areas around the project. But for me, as I say, 1 year to 6 months, I feel gives me enough time to do something. I can't think of being pushed back further than a year.
What you said originally is correct, that in the world that you're working in, the genre you're working in, because in opera, which I do mostly, those casts and those production teams, they are set, 2 or 3 years in advance. They have to, because a lot of the singers are booked out that far. So that's just the way that works. In dance, it's probably a lot different, and in theater, it's different.
Well, I think it was Prague maybe that I was doing something, and I don't know, there was some scenery in my way, I remember, and I commented that they were doing a changeover or something. I commented on it, and the guy said, "Yeah, this is for La Boheme or something."
Right.
And I said, "Wow, looks like you're a little behind. It wasn't completely painted. It was, it was close, but not really finished." And he said, "Well, it doesn't open for 3 years." So,
They're just storing it in the theater.
Well, it's one of those times that you realize it's better to say nothing than seem like a complete fool. But it was just that day they were checking all the scenery, making sure it would work, and
smart.
Putting it into deep storage somewhere before they opened the show, and they were moving on to something else.
Right. That's pretty cool. Stan, how about the architectural world?
Yeah, I was going to say, so in our world, I think there's a couple of things to question about what do you expect. I think you learn that over time. The more experience you have, you become better at analyzing the project and the scope of work, what your responsibilities are, and what you think is a reasonable amount of time, because based on your past experience. So when your experience level is low, I think it's harder to do that. So look to people who have more experience for some guidance, and that's what I did in the early years of developing what I do. Also, as Steve points out, whether it's in architecture and construction or theater or whatever it might be, scope matters. So you understand what your scope is and make sure that that scope of work is clear between you and whoever's hiring you. If Steve's not dealing with drafting and programming and all that stuff, it's a different, you got to know what your workload is. And then in terms of projects, like long timeline, for us, it's a little bit different. We might get a call on a project to come and take a look at a space or whatever, and we might not hear anything for a year or 2 years or 3 years or sometimes even as long as 5 years.
Yeah.
And you think the project is gone, but they've been fundraising or they've been doing other things. And all of a sudden you get a phone call out of the blue. By the way, we haven't talked to you in 3 years, but we're getting ready to move on this project. And I'm like, oh, okay. So we have a lot of those that are floating out there right now, where we have done like preliminary studies. We go out and do a site survey, we get a small fee, we provide a document, and then they sit. And sometimes they come back and sometimes they don't. But once we enter negotiations, I think that's when we get a sense.
Yeah, one thing I want to add to that when you're talking about scope, if you're a designer like me who does multiple things, like some shows I light, some shows I do the lighting and I do the projections, some shows I do the scene design and the lighting, all that you have to take into consideration as well, because obviously it's going to add more time. But in a way, I find that it actually saves time because I hit my deadlines. You know what I mean? I said, I'm going to have to set design by Tuesday so that I can start figuring out the lighting for it. But actually, it's a lot easier because I'm thinking about lighting as I'm designing the set. So it's actually, pretty efficient in that respect.
Well, Janet, all the way over there in London, asks, I enjoyed the discussion of the McCandless system this morning. Here's a question. How much did the Eisenhower-designed or Eisenhower-inspired theaters built across America in the mid-century add to the McCandless-esque system of front light?
McCandless-esque. I like that.
McCandless-esque, it's hard to say. Candle-esque. I think that Janet's onto something. I think that those guys, that team out of the Yale Drama Lab, had enormous influence from the early part of the 20th century all the way through probably the late 80s and into the 90s. They became an authority, and they were asked as a team to design performing arts centers and theaters across the country, and those ideas and concepts are clearly embedded in the concrete and steel now. You can see them. So I think a lot. I think there's two great books by George Eisenhower, Theater Design, and there's 2 volumes, and I use those as references for all kinds of work that we do. They're hard to find. It's a rare book, but our architectural library here at UF has copies of that. And I remember a colleague, I'll call out Rob Shakespeare, who taught lighting at first at University of Massachusetts and then at Indiana. And Rob had this system that was sort of the next phase of McCandless lighting that Steve brought out last time in the conversation, is sometime you're going to eventually hit a wall and you're not going to be able to maintain those angles across the stage. And I know Rob was working on methodologies to sort of take that Eisenhower system to a more practical level and for a variety of spaces. I don't really know how that turned out in the long run, but I do think we have some friends who were at Urbana-Champaign. The Cranach Center is one of those facilities where I think that Eisenhower and McCandless really put a lot of their ideas into practice acoustically as well, and transforming the acoustic envelope of those spaces. I have not been to them, but that's a good case study. So I would just say, if you're interested in that question, I would take a look at the Stanley McCandless syllabus for stage lighting and look at that. And then I would look at George Eisenhower's books on stage design, and you'll probably get a good insight into how those things interacted with each other. You are listening to Light Talk with the Lumen Brothers, and Light Talk is sponsored by
Gracious greetings of Butte, Montana. We are at a critical and hopeful time as America slowly gets back to business, reopening restaurants, bars, nightclubs, and hopefully theaters. The time to get back to work is quickly approaching, but are you prepared? Are you worried that your phone will not ring with new gigs because all your former directors may have forgotten you? Will you be the spoiled chopped liver of the 2020 pandemic? Well, Gracious Greetings of Butte, Montana can help remind all your former job contacts that you have indeed survived the pandemic and are now ready and eager to get back into the theater. To help you subtly spread that message, Gracious Greetings of Butte, Montana presents their new Busby Berkley line of, "Hey, let's do a Broadway show," gift baskets. Inspired by those great old Depression-era Busby Berkley movies like The Gold Diggers of 1933 and Dames, Gracious Greetings introduces our new Virus Fighters of 2020 gift basket. Arranged in a stylish kaleidoscopic design and best viewed from the top, the basket includes hundreds of useful items for the reopening of Broadway theaters. Tired of wearing those boring face masks? Well, the Virus Fighters of 2020 gift basket includes a newly designed Broadway-themed mask with those irresistible and eternally classy comedy and tragedy masks, outlined in rhinestones. The director who pulls this out of their basket is guaranteed to remember you in the most tasteful way. Why the hell did she send me this? Remember in those great Busby Berkley movies where the cast and crew decide to put on a Broadway show at noon and open it at 8? Where did those 500 grand pianos come from? Well, the basket also includes a special kaleidoscope that multiplies any object you point at it by 32. Don't think that's useful? Try it on your dog. Hilarity ensues. To satiate their hunger, deep inside the basket is a copy of Carmen Miranda's Tutti Frutti hat that she wore in the movie The Gang's All Here, enough to satisfy a green room full of starving actors. But the piece de la resistance is a Tony Award with the director's name engraved in it, with printing below that says, "For being wise enough to hire," your name, as his lighting designer. Subtle? Yes, but the strong subliminal message is sent. So when the gigs return, why be replaced by a younger, prettier version of you? Gifting your job leads with the Virus Fighters of 2020 gift basket will remind your directors that nothing will keep you from relentlessly popping up into their lives, just like another bad review.
And now, back to Light Talk.
Well, the sound of those rabid ducks in the background tells us that once again it's time for Let's Talk About. And today's Let's Talk About is kind of timely because people are sort of putting their studios back together. And it actually comes from another student. This is 3 weeks in a row that we had students give us Let's Talk About ideas. And the question from the student is, now that they're getting out, which computer platform should they invest in? PCs or Macs?
Oh, that old question.
This is a question that's gone on for 40 years, right?
Yeah. Windows Vista.
Right. So actually, Stan just built a new computer, and because he was a Mac person for a long time, and now he's built a PC computer. So why don't we leave it to Stan and hear what he has to say, and then we'll chime in.
Well, okay, just a brief history. So because we're old guys, I started with computers before there was Windows, right?
MS-DOS.
MS-DOS, right?
MS-DOS.
Floppy drives and no hard drives and math coprocessors. And so for years and years, I was a Windows user until I'm guessing it was the, I don't know, late 90s, mid 2000s, early 2000s, where they just, Microsoft was, I don't know what they were doing, but they were not building good software for the average user. I was spending more time trying to keep that stuff running than I was using it. So I really got annoyed. And I bought, I think it was, I'm not sure what year, 2011, 2010, I bought an iMac and I fell in love. And they just work, right? They just didn't have those flaws. They were wonderful. They were reliable. They cost a little bit more, but boy, you didn't mind. And over the years, because I'm into 3D and I'm into visualization, a lot of the softwares that I was using, particularly one in particular, the CAST software product, is a Windows-based thing. So I was using Boot Camp on my Mac, and then I was using Parallels, and it just doesn't quite do it.
No, it's not powerful enough.
What I learned was that if Microsoft had made a decision that what could they do in a space that would not compete with Mac, because Mac was so dominant. And I love my Macs, but gaming became a big thing. And they really put their chips on gaming. And so they really built software and infrastructure to handle three-dimensional activity. And so for lighting visualization and rendering of three-dimensional spaces, Windows sort of wins out now. And so if I'm doing Photoshop or I'm doing pixel-based stuff that's 2D, can't beat the screens on the Macs. The retinas are fantastic. But I just was so frustrated I couldn't use those programs. So I did go out and build myself a killer PC. I call it the Beast. I love it. It's got lots of room for expansion. The graphics card was just one notch down from the best you could buy, but I could always double that and really go crazy. And I'm using Lumen now, which I'm loving as a rendering program, built for architecture, but does theater work too. And I'm discovering it would be a fantastic way to create renders and fly-throughs and imagery. So I'm doing both, but I'm in a different position. If I had to pick one, God, I don't know. I love my Macs. I love their reliability. But if money was tight, I might go PC because I can probably get more computing power for the PC than I can get in the Mac at the moment. But I might get more, you might say you might get more frustrations, but I have to say Windows 10 had it now for 6 months. I've had it in my office for a year to test it out, and it's been pretty friendly and pretty reliable. And Microsoft's culture has changed. I can text with them. They answer my tech support. So that culture on the Microsoft side is not what it used to be either. They've really stepped up to the plate. So I guess in essence, if you have the money, both. If you have to pick, either. But the PC is not what it used to be. It's a much more reliable platform now.
I guess my question is, what can't you run on a PC? I mean, you could run Vectorworks on a PC, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you
all
could
the
run
Adobe products,
right on it,
yeah,
right?
Right.
All the Adobes.
Yeah.
What are we missing?
I don't think it's the PC. I don't think that's the issue. I think it's the operating system, and I think gamers ignore the kind of. I mean, I think if you're a gamer, you build your own machine, but you power that with Linux.
Yeah, that's true.
You don't go with the Windows operating system. So you have a lot more flexibility in what you can build, and you can custom your machine to do exactly what you want to do. So, yeah, PC, but it's the operating system that's the issue. And the Mac operating system for gaming, I don't think is that great, and I don't think Windows is that great.
The question came from a student who's just getting into the business. So it's obviously from someone who wants the most flexible machine to run the software that student's going to need. A lighting designer, typical lighting designer.
Yeah.
So other than something like QLab, what programs can they not run on a Windows machine?
Well, you couldn't run Isadora.
Right, Isadora.
You would have to run Watchout.
You know, it's interesting. Stan had the opportunity to give Windows another chance. I'll never give them another chance. I'm done with them. Totally done. I just would rather just stay in the Mac world. I'm happy with Mac. I don't need the type of software that Stan's running. If I did, I would probably look elsewhere. But I think you really just need to look at what your own needs are and see, and then make a choice.
You know, I will say what inspired me to finally break down and do that, because I love my Macs, is I really wanted to run WYSIWYG more comfortably, which is a Windows only. And I really wanted to use Lumion, which is Windows only. And I am so excited about what I'm doing in that software and what it's going to provide to me. Now, the problem I'm going to face is I'm doing a course in facade lighting in the fall, and my students already are good in Vectorworks and WYSIWYG, but they're not in Lumion. But Lumion will give us renders that are just so artistic. It's not going to do the photometrics, but the visuals to sell a client on an idea are just extraordinary. So I'm not sure how we're going to handle that.
You know, my only problem with Mac is the stuff they embed that you can't get rid of. And there are several things in Mac I would like to clear out of my life to make my machine run better. But, you know, I don't think you have to buy a Mac. You have to spend a lot of money on a Macintosh. I think a couple of years ago, I bought a Huawei, which is now on the United States hit list, but I think they'll be back someday. The Huawei is everything the Macintosh or the MacBook should be at maybe $1,200. It's an incredible laptop. I think much better than the Mac. I think if you're a Mac user and you switch to a Huawei, you're going to be impressed greatly by that.
Well, you know, MacBook Pros are starting very close to that price nowadays. They've really gone down in price, and not maybe $1,200, maybe like $15, and then going up to like $22 or $25. But yeah, you know, the prices have come down on Macs. They are getting more competitive and more powerful.
I just got a new Mac Pro from the university, and I was real excited. And they got me, and they know I do a lot of graphics, and they got me a really good one. It's not even a year old, and I put parallels on it, and I wanted to run Lumion, and I sent the specs to Lumion, and they said that machine won't run it.
They laughed at you. The
graphics are just not there. You need these high-powered NVIDIA chips. Right. You know, to really run that kind of stuff. If you want to make imagery and fly-throughs that are with luminosity that are truly compelling, and maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want to work in watercolor. Maybe you want to work in Photoshop. There's different ways of working. I just sort of fancy that. I just like it for me.
That's cool. Well, Steve has our final listener question.
Debbie in Fort Collins, Colorado writes, "Why is Broadway called the Great White Way?" It's interesting that you send this question in, being a female. You know, at one time, New York was dark. It was gaslit. And if you weren't a prostitute, as a woman, you did not go out after sunset in New York.
That's
and
right.
It's interesting because New York is one of the first places in the 1880s to bring electric lights in. So that whole area, that is Broadway, was lit by electric lamps, and it meant that families could go out after dark again. But they lit that whole area with incandescent lamps, and they called it the Great White Way. So it is a reference to all those lamps. And certainly if you go to New York today and you look at Broadway and you look at all the marquees that are up, And now we have all the giant LED signs and movies playing. It is the Great White Way. It is probably the best lit place in New York.
It's not the Great White Way. It's the Great Solar Flare Way. It's like living on the surface of the sun. It's so bright there.
That it is.
Okay. Well, the rocking sounds of the Luminoids tells us that once again you spent another morning listening to Light Talk. You can hear our show on Spotify, iTunes, Google, just about every podcast site out there. Check out our website on lighttalk.org for future guests, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. That way you will not miss a second of Light Talk fun.
No guarantee is offered regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast. However,
If you should choose to litigate, the law firm of Fleck, Flock, Flare, and Glare, and our paralegal Snoot will defend us until our retirement funds are depleted.
Light Talk is written and produced by the Lumen Brothers, coming to you from Long Beach, Gainesville, and Lone Star State.
And be sure to tune in next week when we have friend, educator, and an amazing lighting designer, Mr. Mark Stanley, here on Light Talk.
All of that and a new sponsor.
Light Talk, broadcasting questionable Lumen knowledge and humor around the world.
And we'll see you all next Saturday morning. Stay healthy and happy. Bye-bye from Light Talk.
So long, everybody, and keep those PCs on.